When it comes to rural properties and water supply, we're looking at wells, and there's generally two types of wells that you'll see most common in our area. One is the drilled deep well, and the other is the dug shallow well. And those wells, when we're writing an offer, helping a buyer purchase a property, we're putting in conditions there to test the water. And there's two different types of tests. There's the quantity testing and there's the quality testing. So when it comes to quantity testing, that's like gallons per minute. With the drilled deep well, we can have a recovery test done to show how many gallons per minute. It's much more difficult to do with the shallow well because that's relying on surface water. But if you're looking at a deep well, how do you know if it's good or not? In general, 1.5 gallons a minute will supply a household with no problem. So if we have wells that are producing less than 1.5 gallons a minute, you're likely going to see a cistern or a holding tank system to add a volume of water for the household. Now, when it comes to the quality testing, we're looking at potability tests. So the potability test is whether that water is safe for drinking. That's a bacteria test. We send that away for analysis. There's also a further test you can have done, which is a full water analysis, which gives you the mineral content. So like iron, sodium, all the minerals that could be in the water. And you want to know that because if you're putting a filter system on, you know what kind of filter to use. So if you're shopping for rural properties, one thing that you're going to have some knowledge about, or you're going to come across with larger parcels of land, anywhere from 5 acres up, is typically the Agricultural Land Reserve, or the ALR. What this is, it's in British Columbia, and land was put into the Agricultural Land Reserve, which meant it was designated for agricultural purposes, not for development. So properties that are in the ALR will typically not be subdividable unless you have a very large parcel. And that's a very long process to go through. But yeah, ALR is ag land. Just because it's zoned ag, you can have like an AG1 zoning, doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the ALR. So you want to know, you want to ask your realtor. We can look online to see, there's mapping that shows where all the ALR land is, but there's special restrictions within the Agricultural Land Reserve that trump the zoning bylaws. So if you're looking at a property and the AG1 zoning says one thing and the ALR zonings, or the ALR restrictions and rules say another, you have to go by the ALR rules. If you're shopping for rural property, one thing that comes up quite a bit is who's looking after my driveway or my access roads? So that's really going to depend. Now, if the road coming in, it could be paved or just hardtop or gravel, that is typically looked after by the local municipality. However, your driveway, you may have a long driveway into your property, that's going to be your responsibility. Or it could be a shared driveway also, depending. And we have some strata acreages there where the rules are a little bit different. So you definitely want to ask some questions about that. Who's looking after my driveway? But in general, if it's on your property, it's your responsibility. But the road that you're coming in on, if it needs to be graded, if it's gravel and gets a little bit rough or it needs to be re-graveled, you're going to be reaching out to the municipality to look after that. When it comes to rural properties and how long they take to sell, it really depends. Some of them sell very quickly. We've got lots of buyers, we get multiple offers. Others can take a very long time if they're very specific, or there's certain features about that property that make it so it's appealing to a very small group of buyers, especially you get some of these specific horse properties or larger pieces of land where there's not as many buyers for those. But in general, if you get more residential acreages, there's a lot of people looking for those. If they're priced well, they'll sell fairly quick. So when it comes to rural properties, you're typically dealing with septic systems. So for that, we can get inspections done. Now, as far as septics go, and people want to know like where this pass fail. In general, what was explained to me years ago is septic systems work until they don't. So it doesn't matter how old it is if it's still functioning. However, an older system probably doesn't meet today's standards in terms of the size of the tank and the size of the field in relation to the square footage of the house. So there's a lot of factors that come through that just because an existing system is a certain size, if you had to replace that, you may need to change it to a whole different system and be much larger. But as far as the testing goes, there's a number of companies locally that are excellent that do these inspections. They're typically running cameras down in through the field so we can see exactly what's going on. If there are blockages, you can get it flushed out. And there's maintenance. If you do have a property with a septic system on it, there's some general maintenance that you're going to want to do from year to year. It doesn't need to be pumped out every year, but periodic field flushing. But if you've got a field and there's blockages in there and they can't get through with the field flush, then those systems will likely need to be replaced. And typical expense on the low side to put in a new septic tank and field system starting probably around $18,000, with the average being in the mid 20s. And for a higher capacity, or depending on the size of your lot and what type of soil, you may have to go to a treatment system, and those can run up $30,000 or more. For real estate sales in British Columbia, we do them under the premise of buyer beware. But there are certain times when the sellers do need to disclose. So it's not up to the seller to make sure that the buyer is satisfied with what they're buying. It's up to the buyer to satisfy themselves, except where there's a hidden defect. And we call these material latent defects. And that is something that a buyer would not be able to find out through a reasonable inspection. So for an example, if you had a crawl space that floods every winter when it rains heavy, but you're selling your house in August, so it's completely dry down there, that would be something that you would need to disclose. I always say it's the thing that when the new buyers move in, that's the first thing that the neighbor comes over and says, oh, did you know about this? So material latent defects, as a seller, you need to disclose those. Even if you don't fill out a property disclosure statement, there is still an obligation to disclose all material latent defects. And as a safe guideline, if you're a seller and you're questioning whether you should disclose something, you should always disclose. So when it comes to valuing rural property, there's so many factors that come into play, especially when it comes to usability of the land. You may have a large acreage, even 20 acres, that has a creek running through it or a deep ravine that makes much of the property unusable as far as farming or flat usable space. So even though it's, say, 20 acres, the marketable value of that is going to be much lower than a flat, usable 20-acre property. Or the same thing, if it's treed or if it's been cleared, or if there's trees on it and there's marketable timber on there, that can add huge value to a property. So if you've got rural property and you're wanting to have it valued, you definitely want to get somebody that's experienced out there to take a look. Because if you have an inexperienced agent looking at your property and giving you a value and they miss something like marketable timber on there, it could cost you thousands of dollars, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So get an expert, get the information, and know what you've got, whether you're on the buying side or the selling side.